Never again.
Never again.
Never again.
Never again.
Never again.
Join Dr. Pius Kamau and the Coalition Against Global Genocide as we journey across the globe, taking a deep look at past, present and impending genocides and mass atrocities.
Listen to experts who discuss not only the history but also the resiliency and mental health of people who are recovering from these heinous acts.
Learn how we can move from bystander to active involvement, calling out genocidal acts where you are.
Why do we need a Genocide Awareness and Prevention Month?
Peter, good morning to you.
Good morning, Pius.
So we are very happy and honored to have you as our guest today. And I would like to introduce you by saying that you're a PhD in Cultural and Applied Anthropology. You're a retired professor from the University of Denver. Currently, you're an affiliate faculty member at Regis University. You're the co-founder of the Denver Hospice and the Rocky Mountain Survivors Center. You're an author of or editor of more than 10 books. You specialize in human rights and international development. Now, Peter, if in addition to what I just said, there's something you'd like to add, what would that be?
Well, I'd like to add that it's been a privilege to be earlier a board member of the Coalition Against Global Genocide, and then currently, along with you and others, a member of the Advisory Council of the Coalition Against Global Genocide. It's my privilege.
Absolutely. One thing I would like to take a moment to do is to give thanks to the president of the Coalition Against Global Genocide, Rose Dumas.
Our executive director.
Executive director, I'm sorry, yeah. She has done a tremendous job, and we owe her a lot.
We sure do.
So this is, one out for, some kudos to her.
Kudos to Roz, absolutely.
Exactly. So to continue, April is Genocide Awareness Month, as we know. Can you say why you think it is April, as opposed to the other months of the year?
I sure can, Pius. Sadly, April has seen many of the worst genocides, or portions of many of the worst genocides from the 20th and the 21st centuries. If we go back to the earliest confirmed genocide of the 20th century, which is against the Herero and Nama people of southern Africa, while it didn't start officially in April, things were well underway and becoming extraordinarily ominous by April of 1904. Of course, that continued on through 1908, sadly, Germans against Herero and Nama people. If we look at the Armenian genocide, of course, some people say there were two Armenian genocides, 1919, 1922. But if we look to the precursors of the Armenian genocide of 1922, those precursors were unfolding in April of that year. If we go, of course, to the Holocaust, spanning 1941 through 1945, many of the most atrocious events occurred in April, but in other months too, as we know, throughout that 4-year period. If we go to the Anfal campaign against the Kurds of 1987, many of the atrocities occurred in April of 1987. If we go to the Rwandan genocide, of course, of 1994, Tutsis and many moderate Hutus, hundreds of thousands were massacred in April of 1994. If we go, Pius, to the Darfur genocide, which, as you and I know, spanned seemingly many years, officially beginning in 2003, some of the early atrocities in April in Western Sudan. Yes. And then I'll mention the Tigray, possible genocide in northern Ethiopia, dating back to 2021 and then on. Many people feel that that was a genocide or ethnic cleansing, and several, not all, of the most ominous events there also occurred in April. You know, it's hard to say just why it's April. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it's spring. And spring, things kind of open up, and maybe people are more bold in attacking other people as spring emerges. That's my speculation.
So two things which I'd like to point out too, which is what you just described, in a few minutes ago, does not really encompass all the genocides that
No.
that have actually taken place or are taking place.
That's right. There are others.
For example, what's happening in Ukraine, for example, right now. I think we can classify that as a genocide.
Some people are.
Yeah.
Yes.
And some people are also describing what's happening in Gaza as a form of genocide.
Yes, some people are.
Darfur still goes on, by the way.
It still goes on.
It still goes on. And I think also we cannot forget what happened in South Sudan, where more than 2 million people were killed by the North were killing the Christians in South Sudan. That to me was a genocide. Clearly, it took many, many years, but it's a genocide that just kept on grinding on and on and on. Another you mentioned the Herero in South Africa. That's something that many of us don't quite know.
That's right. It should be remembered. It sure should, Pius. It should be remembered.
Yeah,
as many as 50,000 or more Herero and Nama people were killed in that period of 4 years.
Absolutely. And nobody talks about them. Now, interestingly, the German government, I think, did pay some money to the Herero.
They did.
Yeah.
A nominal amount.
A nominal amount, but something, or at least an acknowledgement.
That's correct. And that was more recent.
That's right. Very recent.
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. So the question is, you're an anthropologist. I'm sure your studies and I'm sure your mind is geared in such a way that you see more clearly why genocides occur. Or am I presuming too much?
Well, I'm trying to understand. Let's put it that way. Like others of our friends, we're trying to understand. We don't understand everything, of course. But let me share from an anthropological perspective some of the things I think that are important. Thanks for asking. One would be, of course, that contemporary anthropologists are interested in various cultures and various societies and how they function or malfunction. So that's one reason that we get into the study of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Some of the things that I've wrestled with, which I don't have answers to easily, Pius, there's some common themes, seemingly. The intent to eliminate difference runs through genocides, various kinds of differences. The intent for political domination, one group over another, and to put that ideology above the ideologies or viewpoints of others. Religious interplay. Sometimes I could even call it, Pius, religious combat, one group against another. Yeah. That plays out in many, not all of them, but in many. And then the final point, at least for now, I'd like to mention, is what we anthropologists wrestle with, others do too, called structural violence. Mm-hmm. That's not just the ominous violence that we see where one person kills another or one group kills another. It's also the insidious, embedded violence in institutions which carry on and can contribute to genocides. Structural violence.
Yeah. Another thing which I think is worth remembering is that humanity has such long memories. Is somehow we bear a grudge for long moments. It will go sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries.
That's right.
And then the people will either rise up in revenge against another group, causing a new genocide. And by that I mean, for example, among the Rwandese, the Hutus and the Tutsis have fought each other time and time again. Each time they killed a large number of people. And there's these two tribes that, they live in the same small area, and yet cannot somehow make each other, so be comfortable with each other.
You're right. The revenge and retribution seem to be sad characteristics sometimes of humankind.
Of the human race.
They seem to be.
Yeah.
Sadly.
And I was also thinking about the Armenians, for example, and also the Serbians, Serbs and Bosnian and Serbians. That has a lot to do with the Muslims and the Christians, or the Ottoman Empire, which is several centuries, before. But somehow we still carry in our genes or whatever, in our brains, that someday we are going to avenge our...
Well, I don't think we carry them in our genes, but I think we carry it in our brains and in our culture.
We get them somewhere.
Whichever, somehow we carry on.
Yeah. You have studied Cambodia
Yes, I have.
Quite intensely and deeply. Would you like to say something about that?
I'd like to say a lot about it.
Please do.
Yes, I would. I'd like to feature that today, if I might, Pius.
Absolutely.
And our idea was that this might be called Fateful April, the Killing Fields of Cambodia.
Absolutely.
Because my presentation will span, ironically, April of 1975 through April of 1998. It'll span 22 or 23 years to give you the story that I'd like to share. I want to share it from the point of view of a particular person, because these things always, while talking about large groups, slaughtered groups, massacred groups, which we must do, we have to think about each individual and the story that they bring, that person, he or she, has to share. And so I want to share the story of a gentleman named Hang Ngor, Haing Ngor, a Cambodian gentleman who I had the privilege of meeting approximately 30 years ago. We met in Houston, Texas, at a conference. Hang Ngor had led a relatively privileged life. He was born in Cambodia in a small village in 1940. I've written about this and written about his life in my book, Pius, Global Human Rights, which was published in 2017. As a privileged Cambodian, he grew up in a family that was supportive. He excelled in school, but interestingly, he also excelled at gang fighting. And gang fighting, as he later said, helped carry him through to survival, interestingly. Ngor entered medical school in the late 1960s, and while he was a student in medical school in Cambodia, he met a young woman named Chang Mi Hoi. They fell in love, and not so long after were married. But as the 1970s rolled around and there was some turmoil in Cambodia, some underlying structural pressures, suddenly on April 17th, 1975, a broadcast, radio and in public bullhorns out in the square in Phnom Penh, April 17th, 1975, a day of great victory, of tremendous historical significance for our Cambodian nation and people, shouted the leader of what was to become the ominous Khmer Rouge group. A new regime called Democratic Kampuchea was proclaimed. There'd be no rich and no poor. Everyone would be more or less equal, but all in favor of Angka, Angka, an anonymous, amorphous, godlike something that people were to give servitude to. Not a person, but an ideological something. Well, the structural violence through Angka had begun in April of 75.
One question. The Cambodians, were they Buddhists?
Yes.
They were Buddhists. So...
And by the way, their Buddhist sensibilities allowed this to unfold without too much initial backlash, because they were somewhat passive to what was being presented at that time. That's part of the deal. That's part of how it unfolded. Well, no surprise, people like Ngor, educated people, doctors, others, were seen to be enemies, basically. They were elite, and they were to be either eliminated or transformed into new types of people, either called new people or even new farmers, and to be sent to the countryside. So Ngor was sent to the countryside. In fact, because it was already unfolding that this was very ominous, he and his wife took on some alternate roles. Ngor told everybody in the countryside that he was a simple taxi driver, just coming out to help with the farming under the new Angka, under the new liberation. People were marched in organized ranks, and you could already see, Pius, a kind of Stalin-esque impetus to what was unfolding. People were regimented, and it was not long before Ngor came to call himself, in his later biography called The Cambodian Odyssey, a war slave, working in the fields alongside his wife and many others. In fact, to survive, they had to steal food because they weren't fed enough to do the work they were demanded to do. One day, when he stole a little bit of extra food to survive and to help his wife, They cut off the tip of his finger. Another day, he was beaten for being greedy. Fear enables genocide, and fear was instilled in Cambodian people through this terrible regime. Ultimately, 2 million people are estimated to have died in a 4-year period from about 1975 to 1979. I just want to share a few more things about his life and struggles and ultimate survival. People near him were being murdered if they didn't perform, they didn't dig enough trenches in the fields, didn't do enough irrigation work, didn't share enough food. And at least on one occasion, he walked through a field of corpses, skulls, bodies, the killing fields that he and many others saw, and sometimes had to walk through. One day, an informant who'd been working with him tipped off the authorities that he was a doctor and not a taxi driver. They took him to a kangaroo court, and they hung him on a cross, hoping that he'd perish. He stuck with it, despite ants and other insects biting him halfway to death, and somehow survived. Ngor and his wife secretly then, taking a different mode of survival, took on the role of servants, and they worked to work for a more relatively well-to-do farmer. And as servants under the name Samnang, which ironically means lucky, he wasn't feeling very lucky at this time, he and his wife managed to survive a bit longer. When she became pregnant and didn't have enough food, he was desperate. He tried to steal some food to help her. But she was deteriorating, and sadly, on June 2nd, 1978, she and her baby died in childbirth. Well, this devastated Ngor, no surprise, but he had to go on. As the months went by, he continued to steal food to survive, and in fact, he formed a bit of a stealing gang. I mentioned earlier how he'd been a pretty good gang fighter. He formed a kind of stealing gang which would secretly go to gardens and steal enough food so he and a few of his buddies, including his buddy named Ta, his favorite stealing partner, could survive. I mean, this is amazing stuff, what people do. But as the months went by, he realized that he needed to escape from Cambodia. This was going on and on. About 3.5 years had transpired. Ironically, as he was formulating a plan, the Vietnamese, who had been reviled by Americans, by many other people in Southeast Asia, proved to be, in a way, actual liberators, because they were very much against the Cambodian regime and against the Khmer Rouge. So Vietnamese, ironically, opened things up a bit and enabled some routes for refugees or potential refugees to start moving through the jungles and perhaps getting to a place where they could escape from Cambodia. Right. Unbelievable. Right. The Vietnamese, as in a sense, the liberators, not the Americans. He formalized an escape plan with several of his buddies. They went through the so-called danger zone, which is the zone that led from Cambodia to Thailand. They hired, no surprise, coyotes. We call them coyotes here, right? The ones that transport people for pay and often desert the people they're trying to help. Right. He hired for about $2,000 US, the money he'd gotten by secreting away some gold that he had saved for several years. He hired a coyote. No surprise, the guy took him a ways and then abandoned him. He still had to make it the rest of the way to the border on his own with a few of his buddies through the jungle, and he did. And he made it to the Nong Cham refugee camp at the Thai. And as 1979 rolled into 1980, and the Cambodian regime was collapsing, the Khmer Rouge was collapsing by this time. The genocide had basically stopped. By 1980, he secured passport to the United States and moved to California.
Hollywood.
He moved to Hollywood, indeed he did, not knowing that he was going to become a famous actor in one of the world's most famous movies. Yes. Because, as you know, Pius, at about this time, with the genocide unfolding, people learning more about it, on Sidney Schomburg having written about it in his ominous New York Times Magazine article about a man named Dith Pran, the movie producer, the director Roland Joffrey and his friends came to Ngor and said, "We'd like you to star in this film we're producing called The Killing Fields." And he said, "I've never been an actor. I'm not an actor." Here's what Joffrey said to him: "Just be yourself. You were there." So he starred in the film, the Academy Award-winning film, The Killing Fields. And he won an Academy Award himself as Best Supporting Actor. He played himself and the tragedies and survivals that he had gone through. Well, just 4 years, Pius, after we met in 1996, we'd met in 1992, he was confronted on a Los Angeles street not far from Hollywood by 3 members of the Oriental Lazy Boys gang. Full circle now, from gang to gang.
Gang to gang.
The 3 Lazy Boys, Tak Suntan, Jason Chin, and Indra Lim, demanded his money right there on the Los Angeles street, and he gave it to them. And then they demanded the locket that had a picture of his wife. He wouldn't give it to them, and they murdered him. Ngor survived Cambodia's genocide and was murdered on a Los Angeles street. Yes. And it comes full circle, Pius, to the month of April, because in April of 1998, those 3 boys, the 3 Lazy Boys, were convicted of the murder.
Yes, yes. What a story, eh? Yeah, well, that's it's terrible. It's a terrible end, I think, for a man who had suffered so much.
And who survived.
To be accosted by some lazy do-nothings.
On the street.
On the streets of the most beautiful country in the world.
Yes.
You know?
An ironic and sad but meaningful story.
Yes.
And it's April to April.
Yes. Yeah.
April from the announcement of Anka to April, the conviction of the men who murdered him.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure there's a lot we can talk about Cambodia. We can talk about what's happened between then and now. But that's a history lesson, of course.
It is, yeah, it is.
I think the man who has been ruling Cambodia is a dictator, essentially, and has been in power.
There's still problems in Cambodia. Absolutely.
Yeah.
When I traveled there 3 years ago, I met survivors of the genocide, and they talked about still, it's not as bad now as it was, but there's still problems in Cambodia.
Yeah.
You know what I wanted to say too, Pius, and I know our time is short, as we bring this full circle and as we compliment the other podcasts you've done, which I've greatly appreciated, what you and Julius Hinton have done, is 2 words that keep coming back to many of us who work in this field: justice and dignity. Justice, making things right, not just for a person, but for a group of people. That's justice. And then dignity, the individual dignity that we must respect. If any person's dignity were respected, there would never be genocide. Dignity goes with autonomy. If a person's autonomy was respected, there'd never be genocide. But sadly, dignity and autonomy are not respected.
Another question I think one would want to ask is, after the genocide, and after you are talking to this great man, this great doctor, did he tell you what he thought should happen now that genocide is gone?
Yes. Briefly, we didn't talk in detail about that, Pius. But a benevolent democratic leadership for a country, for any country, to pursue democracy.
Would you then say that what happened in Germany after the Holocaust was ideal?
You mean the transformation in Germany after the Holocaust?
Right.
I wouldn't say it was an ideal, but it was certainly an improvement.
Yeah, no, because I think one of the things I think that Germany has done is, to make it illegal, first of all, to deny that there was a Holocaust. That's one thing. Because quite often, I think a lot of the people who commit genocide turn around and pretend it was not a genocide.
Well, let me build on that point back to Cambodia. Thanks for asking.
Sure.
You're exactly right.
Sure.
Pol Pot,
Yeah.
the ominous leader of Angka and of the Cambodian genocide in the late 1970s, till his death, which ironically was about the same time as those three fellows were convicted of murdering Ngor, about the same month even. Until Pol Pot's death, he basically denied that he had done anything wrong, and that what had happened was a transformation that failed of society, not a genocide. Total denial.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, the Turks, even up to this day, do not accede to the fact that there was an Armenian genocide. I mean, they continue to
resist that notion.
To resist and deny it.
That's right. We have to label these things.
I think
we have to label them.
It's important that they be named.
They do. They need to be named.
You have to name it.
Yep.
In some of my discussions in this podcast we've been doing, we have talked about the black slavery in this country for the 400 years that blacks were slaves. We believe essentially, after logical discussion, that what happened was a genocide. Now, a lot of academics may sort of say, well, actually, it does not sort of, it doesn't have to fall along the definitions of the genocide. But I think it is genocide. Well, I think we need to name these things.
We need to name them and discuss them, including what happened to indigenous Americans, of course, over the same 400-year period.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. I think it's easier to deny some of these things, and then you don't have to discuss them.
That's right.
And then you don't have to. I think a sense of guilt, I think, is important also, which essentially I think the Germans, I mean, have sort of taken to heart, quite well. I think. I mean, as a people, they really have done an extremely great job. So, a few of the genocides that we have not touched upon. The Japanese and in China, there's one particular incident in Nanking.
That's right. The so-called rape of Nanking. That's right.
Which is characterized by the acronym, the rape of Nanking. Would you want to say something about China?
I would. Ironically, I just returned from Japan and chatted with a number of very informative Japanese people while I was there, just with my wife, Kathy, last month. We didn't get into details on this topic, but we certainly reflected upon it. I see a parallel in some ways with that and the genocide of Srebrenica in Bosnia. In other words, a targeted campaign against people. Did it eliminate all the people? No, it did not. Did it exterminate or extirpate all the people of that culture? It did not. But did it target, abuse numbers, thousands of people in a genocidal way?
8,000 in one go.
In Nanking and in Srebrenica? Yes. So those are the things, I agree, Pius, we have to talk about and we have to label them. By the way, just as an aside, and that's not the main theme today, the same way we have to talk about critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those two important themes that we have to talk about and wrestle about across the board. They have to be named and they have to be discussed.
We thank you very, very much. This was wonderful.
The Never Again podcast is presented by the Coalition Against Global Genocide and its mission to educate, motivate, and empower individuals and communities to oppose genocide and crimes against humanity.